This presentation is provided by BoardPack LLC for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. The opinions expressed by the presenters are their own and not necessarily those of BoardPack. On behalf of BoardPack, we welcome you to today's webinar. BoardPack has teamed up with Amazon's #1 best-selling author in board governance, Thomas Bakewell, and fundraising guru Carol Wiseman to help educate boards on the latest industry trends. The Boardroom webinar series will focus on different topics each month through the end of 2015. I wanted to mention really quickly that BoardPack is a secure, affordable, and easy-to-use paperless board meeting solution. Users can access materials from the native iPad app or through a web browser on other devices. Private annotations, minutes builder, and unlimited document storage are a few highlights of what we have to offer. Before we jump into today's topic, let me tell you a little bit about today's speakers. Thomas Bakewell works to bring out the best your team has to offer. He is the author of the book, Claiming Your Place at the Boardroom Table. Over the past 30 years, Thomas Bakewell has advised and directed CEOs and presidents of large for-profit and nonprofit corporations. His vast board experience has made him a leader and go-to source in board governance. Carol Wiseman, president of Board Builders, is an internationally known speaker, author, trainer, and consultant. Carol specializes in volunteerism, fundraising, and governance. Carol won a Telly Award for her PBS special, Building a Board with a Passion for Mission. Her board experience is vast, having served on 38 boards and served as president of 7. Carol and Tom, take it away.
Good morning. Tom Bakewell here and Carol Wiseman. Carol, what are we covering today?
Today we're talking about crisis management.
Oh my. That's a board topic?
Absolutely.
Okay,
it can
tell
hit
me. Tell me why.
Any organization, whether you're a government, whether you have your own business, whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit, crisis happens.
And it can happen internally, it can happen externally, it can happen expectedly.
Yeah.
Not so much, mostly unexpectedly.
Right.
Okay.
So I love this quote from Melanie Herman, and she's the CEO of a wonderful organization called the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. And she said, if you want to avoid all risk, do absolutely nothing. And yet, it doesn't work.
No, that's really true. That's one of the things when I speak on risk. One of the slides that I use is a teeter-totter, and on the one side it shows strategy, and on the other side it shows risk.
Yeah.
And look, if you don't want to have risk, put it all on T-bills and call it a day, and don't run a business.
Right.
You know? So there you have it. Now, what
Make
do you have
nothing,
here?
help nobody.
So you said do nothing, but at the same time, even when you do nothing, the Twin Towers fell. We're talking about, of course, 9/11. New Orleans flooded, Katrina, and Madoff got away, or Madoff, as some people like to say, with billions. The good news is actually some of that money is coming back in. What do you have to say on that?
Well, exactly. Things happen, and so you have to be prepared.
Yep.
It is a time of instability, and it's very different for different organizations in the sense that you really need to plan differently depending on what kind of organization you are and what you're vulnerable with. And Volkswagen recently has had major problems, which they certainly didn't expect in terms of their brand. And people are even saying whether Volkswagen will survive their environmental issues with their cars.
So this is touching on an ethics issue, and it seems to be going deeper and deeper and deeper, as if it's pervasive throughout the entire company. We'll see where it ends up, but obviously this is costing them billions and putting a large public worldwide company that's really tied closely to the German economy totally at risk.
Well, and not just the German economy, the world economy.
World economy.
Absolutely.
Okay, now what about Hadassah? What was their crisis?
They were one of the victims of Madoff. And it's a Jewish women's organization, and Madoff had their money, and Madoff still has their money.
Good. And I'm not familiar with the National Hemophilia Foundation. I know them, but I can guess their crisis probably has something to do with AIDS.
Right, but we're going to touch on that a little in a few slides and talk about. But it's very different, and you have to plan differently depending on what your work is and where you are.
So a couple good examples of crisis. So you say the most important question to ask is, what is the most important question to ask?
What would you do if?
Oh, yeah.
And these are the kinds of things that I love creative pessimists.
Right.
And they usually prefer to be called realists, but people who have high anxiety, and anybody who is a conspiracy theorist is great at this.
Well, I don't come that close, but I think you're talking about a personality that I also often run across in organizations. It's what I call the different drummer, or the person who sees the world differently, or the one that keeps the organization honest, or the one who's always willing to say, well, that's beautiful, but have you thought about this?
And that is a great phrase that you hear from someone. Have you thought about this?
Right. Okay.
And really, some organizations have very different kinds of problems. And schools obviously need to protect children from kidnapping and predators. Obviously, you don't have to worry about finance in the sense that children don't have money. And if you're caring for the elderly, there's a lot of elder abuse that's financial, which is quite different.
So you have mosques and synagogues. We have the tragic issues of the terrorism going on. I would add to that, wasn't it Charleston, where a Baptist church was terribly impacted by a terrorist as well, and then high tech and manufacturing. What are some of the issues that you've seen there?
Oh, the biggie is trademark infringement.
Of course. And you say the list goes on. The one that I've seen recently, we're sitting here in a beautiful part of St. Charles County, and we're just a mile or two from a casino, not even that far. And I worked with a CEO once who they had just done a risk review, and along came a hurricane and it lifted up one of their casino boats, which they had not in a river, but in a nice pool of water by the river for safety.
A boat in a moat.
A boat in a moat, and it was lifted up and moved away. And they said, now, who would ever thought we would have had to, tie that boat down such that
a creative pessimist.
Exactly, creative
would have
pessimist.
said, what if?
What if, exactly. So,
this is the stupidest thing I've ever said.
were you a board member, or
Yes.
were you being a consultant, or just being stupid?
No, I was a board member,
Okay.
and this was a number of years ago, and actually it was in 1980, and we were doing scenario planning, and this was a very common form of strategic planning. And this guy said, what would happen if there was a complete contamination of the blood supply?
And that was like, how can that happen?
Yes, and I said, and this was my stupid remark, right, and what would happen if there were a nuclear war? I thought it was as likely as a nuclear war.
Okay.
And by 1982, there was a complete contamination of the blood supply.
And tell us a little bit more about that history.
What happened was they used what's called a pooled product, and I was a hemophilia social worker, and 100% of the children I work with died.
Oh, my.
100% death rate. And so it absolutely happened 2 years later. And the other thing that happened is the Medical and Scientific Advisory Committee made a bad call. And it was a well thought through call. They spent 8 hours. I was in the meeting and said children and adults should continue to infuse. And they knew the risk of bleeding, but they didn't know the risk of HIV.
Oh, my goodness.
And so there were huge lawsuits, loss of faith in the organization. This was a well thought through recommendation, but a wrong one.
Yeah, and sometimes you see this. Sometimes you see medical procedures that are early in their development where people they question it and they don't know where it's going, but that's just the reality. So the point here being that we can't ever see completely around corners, and there's always going to be the next crisis that we never imagined. Who would have imagined the Twin Towers coming down the way it did?
Exactly.
Okay, good.
And where do you start planning? It's really about contacting the right people and knowing how to manage it.
So whether you're the board or whether you're the management or whatever, you start asking the questions, where do we start?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So think about Katrina, and I love California, except for when it's moving or on fire.
Okay, well,
And
that's
so
most of the time.
Such a great place.
Yeah.
And also chemical and biohazards. So what's coming through our town, whether you're rural Iowa or Alice Springs, Australia, these go international. They've had big problems in Australia with fires in the past. And so where are you going to store data safely? And whether it's a board portal, but it's much more than that. It's all your records and your valuables.
So, and on and on and on. You're just hitting a couple points of what could be an extraordinarily long list of things to do to prepare for an emergency.
And it is an unsafe world. And I tend to be an optimist, and I'm someone who goes, oh, that'll never happen. But the older I get, the more I realize that things do happen. And who would ever think that going to a movie theater, you'd get shot?
Sure. I went to a recent opening, and sure enough, it was one of these popular movies. And I've noticed now that the theaters on opening night have gone to having a security guard, an armed security guard. So.
Right, and we can't come in costume anymore, Tom.
I know. But so, hey, look, sometimes I dress up. So let me ask you this question here. The Harry Potter opening and that kind of. So let me ask you a question here. Where do you start, and how much time do you throw at it? So if you're a board member and you're working for a pretty good size organization, and you don't see that they're looking at risk carefully or having, crisis plans, where do you start? How much time do you throw at it? Just give me a snippet.
I think you spend quite a bit of time, but it's really a subcommittee work, and you work with professionals. That's really the key to this.
Okay.
And it's really very much a subgroup. So you may need a cybersecurity person.
Right.
You may need someone to look through your systems. One of the hospitals in Lower Manhattan, the Langone Pavilion at NYU, the backup generator didn't work.
Oh, my.
And one of my clients' wives was on the 26th floor.
Oh, my.
And had surgery the day before and had to be evacuated.
Was it during Katrina or
during
9/11?
superstorms?
Oh,
no, superstorm. See, that's just it, Tom. Yeah. Was it this one, or this one?
I know. I have so many women in my life.
Yes.
Oh, well. No, bad joke.
But in fact, it's for a hospital. It's really checking through the systems. It's not up to the board to check the generators.
Yeah.
It's up to the board to say, is there a plan in place?
Is there a plan, exactly. Yeah.
And there's this old saying that I really like, nose in, fingers out.
Yeah, total.
And
that's an old board aphorism, and it's true.
And it's still true.
You have to have just enough piercing questions. And I experienced this not too long ago. I was on a board of what's called a continuing care retirement community with a large skilled facility and continuum of care. And we had the manuals like you wouldn't believe, but we just had an instinct that, were we up? So we hired a recently retired fire chief who just to come in as a consultant, and it knocked our socks off what he came up with. And some of it was, people just dropping the ball, but a lot of it was just insights we'd never thought about. So,
I have a client who had a risk management specialist that had their child in this daycare center. Mm-hmm. And he had a friend of his come in and take his child.
Mm-hmm. Just to see if they were open to,
yes.
if they were at risk. And
they were seriously at risk.
And I'm not sure they were particularly happy about that.
No,
yes and no.
They were thrilled and they were very upset because his friend came and said, and he brought a candy bar. Mm-hmm. I'm afraid I would go a lot of places for a candy bar myself.
Now we got to elevate this conversation.
Yes.
Come on.
But in fact, that's what he did.
Yeah.
And again, this is my family. These are my 3 grandchildren, and I cannot pick them up without a code word.
Yeah.
And you need code words within your organization so that you can transfer information. And that should be set up, and it's cheap, easy. There's nothing to having a code word.
And I won't comment on who I have to call to get my code word when I forget it, but that's another story.
Exactly. So here are action steps.
All right, this is fine print. Kind of take me to a couple of these.
Yeah, and I apologize for the small print.
No, that's great. Come and give us some insight here on what are the key action steps. Is this immediately or while it's happening or to get prepared?
This is immediately.
Okay, all right.
And so the first thing is what happened.
Yep.
And if you look at this 24-hour news cycle, you realize that you can spend 5 hours in front of the TV while they're standing on the parking lot saying, there may be 2 shooters, there may be 3 shooters, we don't know, blah, blah, blah. And it really takes some time to figure out what's going on. So before you rush into anything, is someone fleeing the country, or do you need an ambulance? What do you need? Who's in charge? What's taken place? I think this was one of the big failings of Katrina.
Yes.
And there They didn't know the extent
We're
of the
waiting
damage.
for the federal government. Is the state in charge? Is the mayor in charge? Is
The Eurozone.
Yeah.
I mean, who's going to
in charge?
rescue
Yeah.
these people?
Gotcha. Yeah.
And this was really who is in charge, and get the right team together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very different with something like Katrina versus a financial crisis, and we'll talk about that a little later. Who's the right person on the team?
Yeah.
And what internal resources are available. So who can we use? What can we use? And we're going to talk about outside professionals and what is the scope of the damage. And that's the kind of thing that it really takes a little while to figure out.
Yeah. Now, so I want to get back to this issue of what kind of team you need, but let's go on forward here, and we'll maybe get to that. So, you're talking financial crisis, but whatever your crisis is, what kind of team do you need? Is it large, small?
Well, and for those of you who are young, who are listening to this is from the original Get Smart, and they always talked about being in the cone of silence. And
so they could have secret meetings without the Soviet, whoever the
right,
mystery people
whoever the
were,
bad
Soviets,
people were at the time.
Bad people listening in, yes.
And I'll tell you the normal scenario, and this is where boards go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They bring in the executive committee,
Right.
and on the executive committee is
A lawyer,
who does patent work,
right?
a social worker,
Mm-hmm.
and a real estate person.
Now, this is just a hypothetical. So
Yes.
what's the problem with
And
that?
so it's sort of like the three of them walk into a bar. You know, it's one of those
All right.
situations.
You're going to have to clarify that more for me. then.
Well, they start talking about how we're going to handle this.
Gotcha.
And they're the wrong people frequently.
Okay, what do you need?
Depends on the situation. And that's the big question is who do we need, not what do we do?
So you're talking about to do the work, or so, if it's a financial crisis, you see a forensic accountant.
Yes.
You need them right in the room, or that's who you hire to help find the problem, or what?
That's what you have to decide at that time. Who do we need in the room? Do we need a specialist in PR crisis management? Who do we need? And what's it going to cost us not to pay?
And who's going to be in charge?
Absolutely.
Okay, somebody has to be the point person and in charge.
Right. And
Okay.
it needs to be the right person.
Good.
You have to have a good relationship with the media, whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit. And one of the groups in St. Louis that gets terrific coverage every year, which I think is always funny, is the Greek church, the Greek Orthodox Church.
I go every year and buy the baklava and all the other good stuff.
Absolutely. And do you know how they get the great press coverage?
How?
They send them trays of
Free
baklava.
food, sure, absolutely.
And so every year, if you go to the NBC, CBS, and the other affiliates in St. Louis, they all smell the same. They smell of Greek food.
Sure.
Because they send food, and they have great relationships.
So let's be practical about this. So what are you saying? Every organization out there, from the small daycare to the largest hospital in the community, ought to be working the media ahead of time?
100%.
Really?
Yes. And so when there is a story in the news, you can be a source for them.
Okay.
And so I'll give you, for instance, if you run a hospital and there's Ebola and you have an infectious disease department, you can call and say, would you like to speak to our specialist in infectious disease and talk about what plans we have in St. Louis, Chicago, whatever city you're in, to manage Ebola should it come to St. Louis, Chicago, wherever. And that's how you provide resources.
Yep. Let me tell a story here from not too far away where we're sitting. Again, we'll leave all the names out of it. But in my first year of college, I worked for a local hospital. And one of the jobs I did late at night was sit the switchboard. Okay, it was great because I got to study. And after about 8 o'clock, not too many calls came in. And sure enough, right across the river, we had a plane go down. And I got the emergency manual out and said, what do I do? And it says, declare a crisis and call so-and-so. That's what it said.
Yes.
So I declared the crisis and called so-and-so.
And you were 18?
And they said, oh, don't bother. No. And this was the CEO saying, don't bother, And there were some consequences of that. And, and fortunately, the medical teams on the other side of the river were able to handle most of the problems and all. It was an interesting little snippet of history. In my first experience, I'd never seen that manual before, and I'm sitting there, what do I do? And, maybe I shouldn't have called, but it's what it said in the book. So the point being, you have to practice and get these policies in place, and the team needs to understand it. So somebody who's sitting at the switchboard needs to know this is part of your job.
Well, and what I love about that story is that, number one, there was a manual.
Yeah, there was.
Yeah, and that you didn't get into any trouble for calling the CEO, whatever time of the night.
That's what you say.
Oh, well.
That's your side of the story.
Okay. The other thing is you need to get media training, and you need to get it right away.
Good.
And you have to decide who's going to be your spokesperson.
Gotcha.
You have about 5 seconds to get your message out.
Yeah, and that's one of the key things about crisis is you kind of got to get it buttoned down right up front pretty quickly. Okay.
And I'll give you an example of someone who did not have media training, and that was with Enron.
Enron.
Not Enron.
What, BP?
Yes.
The oil problem? Oh. British Petroleum.
British Petroleum.
And the oil spill down in the Gulf.
I thought if he had media training, his trainer must have been absolutely having a fit when he said, I just want my life back when people had died.
Yeah.
And he wanted to go back to living the high life, and it was devastating for them. And this is far beyond the elevator speech. You don't have time.
And it also touches on having the right people in the right job. Obviously, he was the chairman of the board and the CEO and a very skilled and talented executive. At the same time, he wasn't the one who was gifted at taking the message out.
No.
Okay.
And some of the resources include Toastmasters, the National Speakers Association. Every time I write a book and go on a tour, I always get media training.
Sure.
Because I have to get the message out about my new book. And it has to be clear, crisp, and really quick.
Very good. Note to self. Okay, what do we got here? If the crisis puts people in harm's way, what do you need?
You need to deal with hazards in the area. Yeah. And this is really important because you may not necessarily know what's hazardous.
All right, can you give us some real examples here that we can kind of relate to a little bit?
Well, water is one of the things, and fire, where how fast can we get people evacuated, especially people that are impaired in any way. So the fragile elderly, hospitals, that sort of thing. Also, the interesting thing on this one is that they didn't take into account at Katrina is that people wanted to take their pets. And there's more and more work being done now so that people can take their pets because lives were lost because the rescuers said, no, you can't take your dog. Your dog's not that important. Whereas for an elderly widow, that may be her life.
Absolutely. Okay.
And for young couples as well, where that's their first child is a puppy. Dispersed greeters, so there are people, and if you can mark them in any way, even if you take a piece of paper and pin it to you that says, ask me, account for individuals so that you find out who's where, and this is always a big problem. And then it's really an issue of triage.
Right.
And you need medical professionals to make those calls. And attend to the needs of the non-injured.
Now, what's that mean? The people that are milling around or just everybody else? What?
This is a long-term strategy, and we find that after 9/11, that 5 years later, 10 years later, and I'll give you an example of one of my friend's husbands had just started a business 2 years before 9/11, was just getting going, and when the second tower was hit, 13 of his clients were killed. His entire client base. He had 17 clients, 13 were killed. And he knew these people well. And so long term, he didn't do well. He went into bankruptcy, he gained 100 pounds, and they wound up getting a divorce. And so he didn't get help after the initial impact. Okay. And so it's PTSD. And you're seeing a lot of it these days. People afraid to go into a movie theater, afraid to go to get a glass of wine on a street in Paris. So these are long-term care that people need. And that's where you have to take care of the uninjured. Preserve everything for forensic use, and this can be anything from, unfortunately, a pathologist,
Sure.
and also for law enforcement, should it be a violent act, and restrict the affected area and objects as circumstances allow.
That's really important. I've had experiences with that as well many times. So, especially back to my days working in a hospital at a young age, even in the ERs and things, they just didn't used to button things down the way they do today with restricted areas of security. Good point.
And get expert guidance. And this is a neurosurgeon that I'm a big fan of, Edie Zussman. And I think I would go to Edie as if I needed neurosurgery, but I wouldn't ask her to replace my knee. And so you really need specialists in the field. Mm-hmm. So cybersecurity is a big issue. Mm-hmm. And it's very different if your business is Target or a for-profit business where you have what they have somewhere around 1.2 transactions a day or a minute or whatever, to a small nonprofit where you have 4 employees.
Yeah. Let's come back to the not-for-profit. We talked earlier about financial crisis, and we didn't really spend any time on that. So here's a question that I hear often regarding not-for-profits and financial crisis, and it's two related questions. One is, can you raise money during a financial crisis? And the second one is, can you raise money for debt? Often they're related.
Yes.
An organization, not-for-profits, humming along and things are going along, and then they suddenly find out they're in debt. The loan payment's coming due, and they have to go raise a bunch of money. They thought they had it, but they don't. Or again, can you do fundraising during a time of crisis? So fundraising during a time of crisis and fundraising for debt. How would you respond to those?
You can do both.
Okay.
But you need to have a very solid plan and a very solid messaging. Mm-hmm. And everybody has to be on the same page. Mm-hmm. So, and it's quite different if you were a victim of Madoff, or if you had an employee that embezzled, or that, and this has happened all the time in the last few years, especially starting in 2008. Your state doesn't have the funds anymore.
Okay, so your budget's just been cut.
Cut.
So an example would be, we're not too far from the state of Illinois.
Yes.
We happen to know from experience, not picking on anybody, but a number of the healthcare providers over there, particularly in the disabled kid departments and
yes.
a lot of the social services departments. On the one hand, they're getting paid their money. On the other hand, it's 18 to 24 months late.
Yes.
So.
And so you've got a float that's a major problem.
It plays havoc with their budget.
Right.
Right.
And if you can go to your donors, mm-hmm. and they're usually your individual donors, they can do one of two things, and I've seen both happen. One is that they can advocate for you with the legislature mm-hmm. to get your money.
Okay.
And I've seen that happen. And number 2, they can write you a check. Mm-hmm. And number 3, they can arrange a line of credit.
Oh, great. If you're the chief fundraising officer, what's the board need from you when you are in this kind of a situation, trying to raise money for a crisis or trying to raise money for debt?
You have to work with your marketing department, mm-hmm. if you're the head fundraiser or the CEO, and say, how can we make this work?
Okay.
And it has to be a clear marketing message. And sometimes one of the groups that did extremely well was a New York university, mm-hmm. not NYU, that during the year after 9/11, they made it a point not to ask for money, mm-hmm. interestingly enough. They called their alumni to say, are you okay? Mm-hmm. That was a brilliant strategy.
That was a brilliant strategy, and I'm sure it prompted lots of giving.
Yes, yeah. And they thought, if you want people to care about you, sure. you have to care about them. Yep. And within the next 5 years, giving went through the roof, yep. because they called people to say, we're not calling to ask for money. We just want to make sure that our alumni are doing okay. And they connected some of them to mm-hmm. other people.
Sure. And I'm thinking also, maybe you know some of this history as well. I don't. I'm thinking of also at Katrina and a number of the universities. A couple of them, like Tulane, did
yes.
extraordinarily well
yes.
despite all the challenges. Some of them really did not. So I guess there's probably was some differences in how they responded as well. So.
Absolutely, and it depends on how old you are, how deep your
alumni base is.
Your alumni, and also, I mean, there are universities where and community colleges where they have 2 people in development offices, and some where they have 1,000.
Yeah, or hundreds anyway.
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, well, so you talk about clarity. This issue I asked you about. What do you need from the fundraising in a time of crisis? Clarity. I've always thought candor is terribly important. As you touched on, very clear in your communications. The other thing I see that really makes a difference, and almost inevitably, it's the fundraising person who's the point person, the chief development officer. So confidence, you really have to have confidence in your message. This is one of the things I've seen in any crisis. It's vital when you get that core team together that you get on a piece of paper a handful of key bullet points that people can talk from that message. And what is our message going to be?
Yes, and I think that Chicken Little approach where, I don't know, you know, the thing that really frightens people the most is uncertainty.
Yep.
And when it is an internal problem where there's been, somebody has embezzled,
right,
which happens from time to time, do you go public with it?
Right.
Do you go private?
Right.
How much is out? All these decisions really have to be made because I would not be happy if I had given, and I have one situation where a client was given $1 million was stolen, and one of the donors who had given $1 million went absolutely ballistic, and I did not blame him at all.
Yeah,
and what they did that was right is they went straight to him immediately, and they said, we have a big problem, and we're going to keep you in the loop. And he was really unhappy. And
they talked him off the ledge.
And then the amazing thing is 2 years later he gave them $5 million.
Yeah. So they managed their crisis at the board level and at the donor level. So let's go from one extreme to the other. I'm going to comment on, see if you have any, you keep up on the world. So we've talked about not-for-profits. Now on the other extreme, you got public companies, and one of the areas where I see them experiencing crisis that nobody would have predicted in the last few years is activist shareholders.
Yes.
Yeah. So you've got a Carl Icahn, or you've got any number of names of these people who are even taking on the major companies, a DuPont,
sure,
or a Xerox, or an IBM, or whatever. Any comments on that?
Well, I think it's in the for-profit world as well. What kind of stock do you hold?
Right.
Who will you take money from? And this can be a big crisis, and it can come out in the public that you have stock in a company that people feel is not reputable. And one of my clients...
So now you're talking about investment policies,
right,
of
but
either
also
a charity or what?
Right. But it can work both in the for-profit and non-profit, and also things that you wouldn't expect. And we're seeing this in retail this year, is that all of a sudden Black Friday, people are sitting in their jammies at home and on the keyboard rather than getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and risking life and limb to get that TV set that they want for $29.99. And so you have to anticipate this. It's a financial crisis for the organization. It's not the same kind of crisis that 9/11 is.
Gotcha.
But it's still, if you're a shareholder, you want to know, why weren't you prepared? Why did your computers crash when I was trying to get that $29
Gotcha.
TV?
Let me top line it here as we do a wrap, and let me kind of walk through what a category I see. Usually about 6 to 8 categories where you have a typical crisis for the typical company. Let me mention each
Sure.
one of them, and you can bounce it back to me if you don't have an answer on that. So one is what I call balance sheet problems. Either there's an asset that's not there, it's disappeared, or a liability's been hidden. Okay, so we thought we had one of the colleges I was on at a young age, we thought we had $10 million in the endowment. And back to the old-fashioned accounting rules, that $10 million had actually been spent, even though on the books of the audit it showed that $10 million had been spent. So balance sheet, you ever seen that? Assets disappearing or
changing. I have a client that's an international client, and they have some land out of the country,
Yeah.
and it was appraised at $8 million, and then people with machetes moved on to the property.
Yeah. Whoops.
Whoops.
Was
and
this one of your rainforest deals?
yeah, and now it's valued at $650,000.
Yeah, and I saw one of those similar. I'll leave the good charity out of mine, but they've had a history of problems over the years. It's astounding because they have so much money, but they were going to build a resort in one of these Caribbean countries, and it was booked at about $50 million, and I'll be darned if a lot of that money didn't just vaporize.
That happens.
Those things really happen. So let's second area that I see, again, for the financial people, it's what I call an income statement problem. And what that basically means is they wake up one day and the business is in the tank.
Yep.
We thought we had a business model. It is gone. I could think your hemophilia problem. Suddenly they probably couldn't get revenue for what they
Sure.
had revenue for, and suddenly
Sure.
their model had changed. Any comments on that one?
Well, and that was the one where you actually had to change the mission,
Yeah.
because the mission was and find a cure for hemophilia and blood-borne diseases. It was that molecular. It went down to that
Yeah.
level.
So the third category is what I call liquidity or capital problems. And again, we kind of talked about debt and those kinds of things. But that's when you run out of money. In fact, this is kind of my favorite. I've done a lot of work with problem organizations with financial problems. And here's the question I always ask people is when do organizations change? Well, one response is when they have to. One response is when the finance dictate it. The more specific one is when they run out of cash. So liquidity issues, you see anything there?
It's exactly as you said. And for those of you who are listening, Tom is not just a JD, he's also a CPA.
Oh,
so
that's
he
all right.
understands this much better than I do.
Now, the fourth category, and it's where actually not so much crisis, but you get the most litigation across the board, and that's what I call people problems.
Absolutely.
Issues related to employment or management, and every organization is going to have lawsuits on a regular basis with employment matters, and sometimes they can really be
Very
public,
nasty.
very nasty and very public. We had a major brewing company here in town. A former executive of the company got bought. The highest-ranking former female employee said, now that all this information is public, I have learned that while I was one of the more senior people on the management team, I was the lowest paid.
Yes.
And major litigation on that, and not a pretty matter. Okay. And then the fifth category is legal problems. People run across them all the time. The sixth category is environmental problems, and especially responding to environmental disasters. So that's a category. You run across that?
Absolutely. And this can be from my nephew is an urban cricket farmer.
Oh, my.
Yes.
Are you making this up?
No.
Okay.
No, name Big Cricket Farm in Youngstown, Ohio.
All right.
And because of fracking, the water is polluted and it's carcinogenic, and it's killing his crickets.
My, I hope we have a legal opinion on that. We don't get sued.
I do
hear you.
too.
Okay.
But the New York Times is following it, Wall Street
my.
Journal. And this is one of those situations with a startup, which is a for-profit, where initially the water was clean, and because it was a startup, they didn't monitor the water, so he bears some responsibility. So it's an issue. It's not necessarily a huge thing like Superstorm Sandy. Everybody
Right.
knew.
Yeah. So I can look out the window here and I can see a spectacular river that I bet's got a lot of good water. So maybe your cricket farming nephew needs to come see us, huh?
I think he belongs in St. Charles, Missouri.
Okay.
Where
All right.
They
There
have
you go.
great incubators.
And the old post office
Yeah.
incubator. All right, good. So two other comments here, and then we'll put a wrap on it. Threats to the company's reputation.
Big time.
Yeah. I think, people always have questions serving on boards. What about the liability? And I always say your number one risk is your reputation.
Yes. And both Tom and I always recommend that you have directors and officers insurance.
Yep.
Neither one of us would go on a board without it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last is failures of leadership and governance. And this is what I see in a lot of times in my work. You hate to see it, but sometimes, So, for example, if I look at an organization that have had CEO issues, there's a list of about 6 categories that are pretty common. Either terrible financial problems, so you have a CEO that really didn't get finances. Another example is what I call MIA. Everybody knows what that is,
Yep.
missing in action. Somebody's having some kind of life crisis or something, and they're simply not on the job, and on and on. So what do you have to close us here?
You really have to plan.
Okay.
End of story.
End of story.
And you have to have some creative people in the room who know where the risks are, because there are things that you would never think of.
So last question on a crisis, should it be overseen by the board as a whole or as a committee?
As a committee.
So back to the small group of key
Absolutely.
people. Should you have that committee picked ahead of time?
Yes, and don't forget, board committees do not necessarily have to have board members. This is a great farm team approach to bringing in an expert.
Good.
And you need an expert.
All right. Carol, we'll see you next time, and great to be with you.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you again to Tom and Carol for your wonderful insight today. If you have any questions or comments for today's speakers, their contact information is on the screen. If you have interest in learning more about BoardPack, please send us an email, sales@boardpack.com. Thank you.